And as you're coming in, please remember that you can activate your chat window by scrolling on the bottom of the screen that you see with Dave's presentation, so that you can type in questions and comments as we go through the presentation. My name is Terry Golightly, and I'm the moderator for this presentation, and I am really pleased to introduce my friend Dave Evelyn to you. We are co-workers at Johnson University, and Dave has over 10 years of experience in course development and faculty support. He's one of 3 instructional designers for Johnson and has heralded and championed online learning with me and with John Ketchen. Now, he's not a course developer per se, but he does have great insights into practical and pedagogical implications behind online instruction. And he recognizes the need to get the technology out of the way so that students can get on with learning and success. He's also actively working on furthering his education into his doctorate degree, and we're really proud of him. So, there you go, Dave. Let's hear about the user experience in Sakai.
Well, thanks, Terry. Thanks for that very kind introduction. My hope is that most of it's true, and people can kind of pilfer you with questions to find out which of those things are true or not. We've only got 35 minutes here, so I want to make sure we make good use of our time. And I'll be honest, I tend to be a pretty fast talker, so if someone needs to raise their hand or poke Terry to let me know to slow down, please be free to do that.
And we are recording.
Good.
So you can watch it later.
Okay, and then you can slow me down. There you go.
There you go.
So this session's on the user experience in Sakai, and I kind of sort of subtitled this somewhere between ketchup and missiles. And I think it's interesting. User experience is always a very interesting thing to discuss and talk about. If you have a discussion going on between 2 different people and you get a third person into that discussion, the discussion can change in some very dynamic and interesting ways. And part of what I hope in sort of going at this is to continue the conversation around user experience in Sakai, but also to have you think about that from the context of what you can affect and what you can do, whether you're teaching courses with Sakai in an online context, blended, or face-to-face in traditional classrooms. So I'm gonna look at some things, so some examples here real quick. I don't know how many of you happen to know this shape here. For those of you that aren't able to see that really well, it's a pencil that's sort of contorted into a shape that looks like Mickey Mouse's ears. And the interesting thing about it is it's a pencil. So part of the pencil is obviously the part you write with, and the other part is the part that you erase with. The problem is there's something about this experience that seems to indicate that no one's going to make a mistake, or it's going to be very difficult to use the eraser part of the pencil. I think it was a really interesting idea on the part of whoever developed it, but I think the user experience here is going to be somewhat unique in a way. I want to look at another example here that kind of gets at this idea of user experience and user, maybe user interface. So this is and some of you may have seen this one before, perhaps, but this is actually a set of stairs that are inside I think it's actually in the emergency stairway of a hotel. So, you pretend that, the hotel is on fire and the elevator's been shut down. And so the way in which you need to escape the building is by going down these stairs. Well, the stairs leave, maybe the stairs are structurally sound, and there are handrails here, so that's good. But the problem is, if you're looking down through the smoke and you're trying to figure out where you need to put your feet, you might have some problems going down these stairs because the carpet pattern and the color really make it dangerous. You may end up having a pile of people at the end of the stairway trying to get out. So this definitely leaves some questions about what the user experience or what the users are supposed to experience in this sort of a context. This is another example, and it's fun to sort of look at these examples in some ways. What you have here is you have a depiction of the buttons inside of an elevator to go to what looks like the parking level, I assume, the first level and the second level. But what you also, it's harder to notice, is that the buttons, the ones you actually depress, the ones you actually touch with your fingers in order to make the elevator go into action, are on the right. But seemingly where everybody tends to push is on the left. Now, you could say that, but you could also possibly suppose that a lot of users of this hotel happen to be blind. And so maybe they are touching that particular area and then looking to see if they can't find where that braille option is to indicate what it is they're supposed to do as far as the floor and that sort of thing. But you can definitely see how the user experience, and in this case, sort of the user interface, is part of what that user experience is. And while we may think, well, an elevator is not a big deal, it can be a big deal, especially if it's not organized in a way that makes sense. Or for example, say the P was on the very top and the 2 was on the bottom, and maybe the 1 was right where it was. It may not make a lot of sense for us as far as the user experience and user interface. So let's go through and try and define what user experience is. There's a lot of definitions about user experience out there. There's been a lot of research done on user experience. You can get whole degrees in user experience or user interface experience. But we have this design user experience is the design process teams use the process design teams use to create products that provide meaningful and relevant experiences to users. That's really important, especially when you think about Sakai or even thinking about your own courses. User experience can even come down to how you actually conduct your course. What's the experience you want your students to have by the time they're done with the course? The experience, deliver them to the place where they are successful at the end of your course. And so this involves the design of the entire process of acquiring and integrating the product, including aspects of branding and design and usability and function. So you can take this definition and we can sort of look at it reflexively into what we see in Sakai and or what you see inside of your course builds or how you design your courses. Now I want to encourage you, if you have questions, please make sure you put those in the chat, because I want to make sure we do spend some time on those, or provide some space for those toward the end. But I'm going to try and sort of get through this, but I definitely want to make sure that we have some time for those. I'm not a user experience expert. I don't have a degree in user experience, but I do have some experience with user experience. So hopefully this is going to sort of push our conversation forward. So a fun thing to do when you don't have time is to go to Google and just Google design fails. This can be a veritable rabbit hole. You can really, you can do this and you can look at design fails that are all over the place out there. There are whole videos on why you need a user experience designer or a user interface designer or both. But it's really interesting to go through these. And the interesting thing about this, and I'll touch on this later, is that in many cases, design fails tend to be things that are just things that are home blind. We are home blind too. We're not aware of those things until someone else that's completely never seen it before happens to see it. But we'll look at some of these here. So let's look at Sakai specifically then. With user experience, there are some things you can control and there are some things you can't control. If you're a developer, you might say, well, there's all kinds of things you can control. I myself am not a developer. I don't have any developer experience. And so it's not an area of expertise that I have that I can just say, oh, well, I can just do that. Now, if I have an instructor come to me and say, well, can we make it look this way a little bit better? Or can we do this? That's something I can probably help with, but I can't do everything. But the purpose here behind user experience is to provide meaningful and relevant experiences to students. That's our largest crop of students, our largest crop of people demographic that engages with Sakai. But we should also be doing that for faculty as well. I can't tell you how many times, there were several years ago, actually, when, and this is part of user experience. I don't have an example of it, but I remember a couple of years ago, I had my boss come to me and he said, why is it that the delete button is right next to the save button inside of Sakai? You know, he would get to a place where he was doing some sort of work inside of a lesson page, and he'd scroll down and he would just move his mouse to click the save button, but not quite move his mouse far enough, and it would land on the delete or the discard or whatever that button was. and then it would just completely discard the content he had just been so hard working on. And so that's part of a user experience. That was a sort of a user experience problem. Make those things farther away from each other. It's part of that user experience. And so it's important for us to be doing that for both students and for our faculty. And sometimes it's hard to get that information out of them. So, but let me give you a little bit of a warning here before we look at Sakai. When we think about user experience, there's the function and fit of user experience and user interface are dependent somewhat on your users. Just like I have 3 children and all 3 of my children are different, how that function and fit of the user experience and user interface is going to be somewhat dependent upon the diversity of your users. And what we typically try and aim for is we try and aim for some sort of, some sort of altogether encompassing thing that works for the majority of people. And so just keep in mind that that's going to be the case no matter what you look at so far as user experience. Users are diverse, so they come from a myriad of backgrounds, so they're going to bring that experience with them about what they think things should do and how things should function. And so they have different expectations of what the user experience should be. Some who are teachers are going to be just like your students, so they're going to have different experiences that they bring to the table. And then also recognize that, and I'm sure there's lots of folks that hopefully are on the session today that have had users that get frustrated pretty easily because they have a set of expectations about how things should work. And when they don't work the way they expect, especially because of the user experience and sometimes because of the user interface, it makes it very frustrating. And then it's always the fault of the platform, or it's the fault of whoever perhaps, designed it that way. Why did they make it do it this way? It could be that they went through and they provided a lot of function and they addressed the need for a function of something, but didn't always think about the actual user interface and how that experience would work. Okay. So another note here I want to try and tell you about is that user interface and UX are not identical. They are not equal things. This is a great little depiction of what that looks like from Patrick Hansen over at patrickhansen.com about the ketchup bottles. You've got your user interface here of the standard ketchup bottle in the top left of this little table here, the long, slender ketchup bottle that most of us are familiar with from the olden days, I guess you could say. But the user experience was that when you tried to get ketchup out of that bottle, you just had to really kind of hammer on the back or the bottom of that bottle with it inverted to try and get just a little bit of ketchup out. That's the user experience. The user interface, in the modern days of ketchup, tends to be you've got this plastic squeeze bottle that actually has the cap on the bottom instead of the top, and that when you store it inverted that way. But then when you go through and use it, it's a squeeze bottle, and all you have to do is squeeze the bottle, and you get some ketchup out. Now, I've used some of these newer ones the past, 10 years, and I always tend to squeeze just a bit too hard and too much comes out. So I think perhaps the user experience is just still slightly off. But just know that user interface is a subset of user experience, okay? So it might be that if you're trying to improve your user experience, you might want to try and look at the user interface as a way to address some of those user experiences to improve them and make them better. But then there are other areas of the user experience that you can also look at, such as workflow. How many clicks does it take for a student to do this or to do a certain set of tasks? Okay, so let's look at some other examples here. I want to look at this parking example, and we're going to jump into some other things that are much more specific to Sakai. Trying to keep in mind my time. I think I've got about 18 minutes left.
That's about right.
So in this example, this parking example, I'm sure we've all stopped to try and park or parallel park. My wife always gets angry at me because I'm a pretty good parallel parker. But the problem is not that. The problem here is in trying to look at this sign and recognize, when am I allowed to park here? And which areas am I not supposed to park in? But you look at the sign here, and I'm not sure if I can actually point it out. You've got a 1 hour parking sign here from 8 to 6. So it sounds like, okay, great. I can park here from 8 to 6 p.m. any day of the week. But then we have this tow away temporary, no parking anytime sign that on the very bottom here of that particular piece says Monday only. So I'm assuming that means I'm not supposed to park here Monday only between 8 and 6, I think. But then down here, we've got no stopping 8 a.m. to midnight on Sundays only. And then down here further, it's a little bit harder to see, but it says no stopping. And it's slightly different here, but it says 4 p.m. to 11:30 Friday, and I think that says Saturday. That's a lot of signage to try and stop. And if you've ever been, like, if I'm just looking at this street here, the street doesn't look like it's a really friendly street. It looks like a street that people frequent rather often. And so if I'm trying to look at that sign and glance to see if I can park here right now, I might have to circle the block 3 or 4 times just to read the sign. And so the user interface here, and in a way the user experience, is pretty poor, at least in my opinion. Let me look at another example here. This is, I'm pretty sure all of us are familiar with microwaves. And some of this gets at the user interface aspect of user experience. When I look at these buttons, and I'll just try and see if I can't zoom into them a little bit more. These buttons on that microwave, some of them do make sense, but some of them, I don't know what they do. If I look at these, now there's one here that looks like it's from Sakai. It's got the hourglass there, so maybe they actually ripped that from Sakai. So maybe that means that it's going to take a while, or I'm supposed to wait. But then there's other buttons on here that I'm not real sure what they're supposed to mean. Maybe this means to add 30 seconds. I'm not sure what this one means, where it's got wavy lines. There's 3 wavy lines, and then this one's got an up and down triangle right next to each other. So some of these buttons that are on here don't also make sense. And so if I'm trying to figure out, how do I use this thing? What is it I'm supposed to do? Sometimes the buttons themselves, or the pictures or the images that are used, don't always lend themselves to a positive learning experience or user experience. And so that user experience is, I'm struggling with the interface. I'm struggling with the technology rather than being able to leverage the technology to get on with my learning. And I think that's part of what we want to do as educators when we're using a platform like Sakai. Here's a third example, and I think this is my final example. This one actually just really, this one just blows my mind. And like, again, I said, you can go out to Google and you can Google design fails, and you could probably spend 3 hours doing that. Don't, okay? Set yourself a timer of, like, 2 minutes, and don't try and explore any more of these than just 2. But it's interesting because when we look at these, we see these and we think, okay, who designed this? Why did they think to do it that way? And it's very possible that there wasn't a lot of thought put into the actual design. It may have been that somebody was just thinking about the function. We've got to have a way that people can pay for parking because we've got to have people pay for parking. But then the actual implementation, the experience, the interface in some cases does not lend itself well to that aspect of what the end goal is. So here you can see, people start at step 1. It's interesting, I think, that in step 1, it's actually on a green placard on this yellow pay parking here vending machine. But then from here, you progress counterclockwise around the face of the machine to get things done. Now, most of the things that I interface with from time to time don't have me using a counterclockwise process, maybe unless I'm trying to figure out what time it is at Stonehenge or something. But you start from step 1 here and you go up. Normally we understand, at least from a Western culture standpoint, we always read from top to bottom, left to right. I know that's not the same for every single culture out there, so I get that. But you go from here, from step 1 to step 2 to step 3, step 4, and then you come over here to step 5 to collect your ticket and possibly your change if you overpaid. So these examples of this user experience are definitely out there, but that doesn't mean that we are immune to them inside of Sakai. One other thing I want to mention too is going back to this example of the parking. This is an example that somebody came up with, and they saw that parking sign and they said, I think I can come up with some other way to look at that. And that's part of what we want to be doing when we look at user experience and the user interface, especially when we're looking at Sakai and your course development. What is it? There are some things in there that just are so busy, or perhaps overly cluttered, that could be done in a more simple way, so that students aren't struggling with what to do, they're struggling with the content of your course. And that's what we really want, right? We don't want them to struggle with the technology. We want them to struggle with the content of the course. So here you've got an example of what that parking sign really means. So Monday through Friday, I can park from before 7 a.m., but then after 4 p.m. I can park, and after 7 p.m. it's free parking, So I can't park there from 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. That makes sense, I get that. And then you've got the rest of it there. I can't park on Saturdays, from 8 o'clock to 8:30. That kind of makes sense. Maybe they have some deliveries that happen on Saturday or something. But the sign on the right seems like it makes a lot more sense to me, and I can read it without having to go through all of the the cognitive overload of the content you see on the left. And so this is an example of looking at how user experience and user interface can be modified to assist and make more sense for folks so that they're moving forward faster, maybe more efficiently and effectively in some cases because of that user experience and because of how we design it. So here's some other design fails, and I think these are a little bit closer to home. And while these are specific to Sakai, they may not necessarily be specific to your implementation of Sakai, but do recognize that there are design issues that we can look to improve, whether they are specific to Sakai or things that are specific to your development, how you develop your courses. So in this particular case, this is just Sakai. We've got a lot of things that are going on here. In some cases, you might think, especially perhaps compared to other platforms that you use, maybe your institution's ERP or your student information system, maybe this is a lot of information to look at and try to sort of sort through. And I think most of us are familiar with this. But this is the overview page in Sakai and in a course. And so it might be that when you're developing it, maybe sometimes you need to think about maybe not having everything appear in the overview section. If it's a matter of making sure, do you use the calendar? If you don't use the calendar, maybe you don't need to have the calendar there because it's cognitive overload. It's more information that needs to be there than is readily needed by your students. This is a different example of this, and I think if I remember right, Terry actually gave me this one. It's from one of our course developers, and I'm not bad mouthing the course developer, but in this case, it's a section of students are supposed to go through and read. That makes sense to me, okay? This is in a lessons area inside of Sakai. But the thing that doesn't quite make sense to me is what things I'm supposed to select with my mouse or click on. You've got typically, you see that anything that's underlined is a hyperlink. I can't show you here in the presentation, but in looking at this in the browser, this orthography articles is not clickable. And then you've got also additional resources down here is not clickable. Now, some people might say, well, that's obvious, you just click on the things that are a slightly different color. But if someone has a color discrepancy, they have a limitation in the colors they can see, that's not necessarily going to be something they're aware of. And so this even reaches into an area of accessibility when we come up with user experience and how we design things. Here's another example inside of a lessons area. The thing that irritates me about this in some ways is the fact that we have these underlined areas here that seem like they're supposed to be hyperlinks, but this also is sort of I don't know it says all assignments are due by 5 p.m. Sunday, October 28th, period, comma, October. The October came last, there's not a period there. I don't know what's going on here. This is really odd. I'm not sure exactly why they chose to do things that way. So just different things that are like that. This is, I'm gonna let this is actually animated. So if you want to go and see this, you can go to the discussions area and you can look at the PowerPoint and you can download it and see it. But what I'm going to show you is essentially a lessons page that one of our developers came up with. I think it could use some user experience improvement. But in a sense, what this course developer had is he had a ton of video content that he wanted to make sure students got the chance to see. Some of it was lecture content, the content that he or she developed inside the course. And so it didn't exist anywhere else on YouTube or anything else, and that's fine. But it made for a very lengthy lesson page. And so when we're thinking about user experience, we want to think about what is it we want our students to sort of engage with, and do we need to focus that content better? And this can come down to even just simply, putting those lessons with pages with subpages, or throwing some of the videos off to another page. But let me just, this is probably not going to show really well for everybody, but I'll show you another page that actually shows a comparative about how that user experience and that user interface can be improved. So I'm just going to let this scroll by here real quick. So you can see there's 2 videos, 3 videos, 4, I think there's like a dozen videos on that page before you get all the way down to the bottom. And the other thing that's problematic about, there's all kinds of font color changes and differences on the page. It really makes it sort of almost glaring in a way. And it's not by any stretch of the imagination, an attempt on the instructor's part to do poorly. it's just, you know, things that we could look at and develop better by way of user experience. So here's 3 different courses that sort of you have on the far right, what maybe some people have seen before, this whole view of that entire page that I just showed you. So if I go over here, I put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There are 12 videos on that one lesson page. And while it may not have been easy to see, underneath each one of those videos areas, those large video areas, there was, the instructor had seen that the lessons area had an add comment function. And so he had placed an add comment function, an add comment function underneath every one of those video areas. Well, if you think about that, yes, let's see, if you had 30 students taking the course and every student commented under every video, that's only going to progressively make this page all that much more lengthy. And so from a user experience standpoint, it's horrible, right? I actually had a user experience comment from another instructor the other day about the add comment function, because he said, yeah, whenever my students actually go to add a comment, when they post, it pushes them right back to the very top of the lessons page. And I said, yeah, that's a user experience issue. And he said, is that something you can fix? And I said, that's actually not something I can fix. But I said, however, if we try and develop your pages differently, we might be able to address it better. So here you can see also, there's a lesson page on the left-hand side. And this is from another course that could have just as many videos, actually. It's got several videos that are actually segmented off into sub-pages in the lessons. So these are sub-pages. And that actually makes the page less lengthy. And it's also got some information here about how items marked with an asterisk must be done as they appear on the page. I don't know if anybody's ever noticed, and I think there's a JIRA out there, but this is part of that user experience and user interface. We don't have anything that really indicates to students what these asterisks mean, or what that hourglass means, or even that green check mark, what that green check mark means on the lessons pages. If you're marking things as required and they complete them, what does that exactly mean? That sort of thing. And you've got a page in the middle here that somehow fits between the two, where it's sort of lengthy, maybe it's too long, but it's not quite as long as the other one. And that's sort of the comment that I make right here, is that, you've got these indicators that we have in some of the lessons pages. This gets into that user interface section and that side of user experience. And we've got these on-screen progress indicators that mean things. And I try not to tell our faculty this, but they feel like, okay, so if the student has a green check marks, that means they've done the thing, right, on the lessons page. It actually just means that they've somehow selected that item. If it's an assignment and they've submitted it, that's different, or if it's an assessment, that might be different. But we don't really have indicators that tell us what those things are really meant to mean for students. And actually, another thing I happen to notice, has anybody ever noticed that the image, the icon for roster and for membership is exactly the same thing? Can you imagine what, I guess that would be really sort of, I guess it's not too bad, maybe because it's in home and in a course, but interestingly, there's other places where that can appear too. So let me just kind of go through some of the design tips for course design in terms of UX and UI. And I'm going to summarize these really quickly here, but I've just kind of got slides that go over each one of these. And I'm not, like I said, I'm not an expert on all of this, but there is some space for us to get better and to improve, both within the context of the architecture inside of Sakai and perhaps the user interface itself. I know in years past, we've talked about trying to make the user interface, much more improved, much more fluid, and in a way perhaps pretty. But we also have to think about UX, and UX also gets to the place where we talk about UX within the context of accessibility. I know Terry's, I think, going to be doing a session later today that has to do with thinking about those things and trying to keep that in mind. But the first thing I would tell you with regard to UX and UI is make sure you do some research. I can't comprehensively put in a 35-minute talk everything that has to do with user experience and user interface when it comes to Sakai specifically, and or any particular course development process. The course development process you use at your institution or your organization is not exactly the same as the one we use here. Or if it's similar, there are still aspects of the user experience and the user interface that you need to consider. And doing some research and maybe spending, I don't know, an hour or two to try and figure out what are these aspects of user experience and user interface that we need to be concerned with, both from a development standpoint by way of the course and by way of things perhaps that we can actually affect change in so far as Sakai is concerned. So do that research. A
5 minutes, Dave.
Oh, thank you. A second tip would be to prototype and iterate. This is a really good thing to do. Steve Jobs said, sometimes when you innovate, you make mistakes, but it's best to admit them quickly and get on with improving your other innovations. So, this is an okay thing to do. Prototype, try and figure things out. Okay, we tried to do that once. It kind of worked. Maybe try and see if you can get some feedback from your students and see what they had to say about how things are working and that sort of thing. And this gets to the second one, seek and implement feedback. Sometimes getting feedback from people can be dirty. Sometimes they will say things that is not meant to be horrible, but it sounds that way. But that's also where you need to try and have an open conversation about how you're trying to improve the process and user experience and user interface. Think about accessibility. Accessibility is huge. You got here a picture of a guy trying to use an ATM that is at least 5 feet tall. I don't know how he gets his money out of there or if you just kind of go running after it, but think about that. It's important to have your content be accessible, and accessibility is an aspect of user experience and often, very often, an aspect of the user interface. Tip 5, workflow and function. A lot of people overlook this because people become really home blind to this. This is essentially an overhead graphic of one of the buildings here on our institution. The letter A is where a student in a handicapped wheelchair has to begin in order to get to letter G, which is actually upstairs in that building. He actually has to go through an entrance at letter B and then go down the hallway to letter C, go further down a hallway to an elevator at letter D, go up the elevator, go down a hallway to letter E, go down the faculty staff hallway to letter F, and then further down a hallway to letter G to get to his classroom. That's a workflow problem. So think about, when your students are doing things inside of your course, do you really need them to go through X, Y, Z, F, G, and F again to get to the things they need to get to? And maybe they do. Maybe they do deliberately have to go through those steps and those processes. And perhaps instead of drawing it out on a single lesson page, you want them to drive through those individual aspects of that concept. And so that's okay. But think about that workflow in terms of, is that something we need them to do, or is it that's just the way it is, and we just make them suffer through having to do that? 6th tip, be careful about color. Color is something you can do. I would really encourage people inside of your course development to use a CSS that helps to designate some of the styling inside of your lessons pages. Also think about that within the context of accessibility. You can check your color contrast for WCAG AA levels, which is good. And also remember white space. But these are all aspects of that user experience that you want to be thinking about. And then tip number 7, consistency is really key. Think about your course development, your user experience from the context of what it's like from one lesson to another and from one course to another. If you have students coming through your institution, then you're really wanting them to have a good experience, right? And hopefully they talk about the experience to other people. But Newton said that every time he drops an apple, it always drops. That's consistency, right? And so we want to try and think about that from the context of user experience and what we do inside of Sakai.
Dave, do you have any comments about user experience and user interface in resources particularly? That's a question that's come up from Bonnie.
Bonnie, that's a really good question. I would say from the context of my own personal experiences, we've typically tried to not have our students get into the resources area very much. And so we surface much of what they need to get to through a lessons area. So it's very deliberate and it's very controlled. On the other hand, if you are doing stuff inside of lessons or inside the resources area that students are going to have direct access to, then some of that comes down to labeling those things inside of the resources area with a lot of discrete terminology. What I might say as paperwork as a faculty member may not make a lick of sense to students. This is whole aspect of user experience has to do with what students expect and what faculty have to interface with. And so in some cases, you can control some of that. But that's also where I'd say you have a little more fluidity in terms of surfacing those things inside of a lessons area. And I'm not sure exactly which edition of Sakai you're using and that sort of thing.
Part of the issue, I think she clarified, is that using resources, using items in lessons, and how to have a better user experience with that. And I'm suggesting to not use raw URLs, for instance, but to make links to destinations and or titles. But we are out of time. So if you have a closing comment, yes, we do use custom CSS at Johnson. That's from Programmita. But just shortly, yes, we do use custom CSS, and that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, it is.
But if you have a closing comment, Dave.
I was going to tell you, there was a user interface issue a couple of years ago. I can't remember when this was, 2018, I think, where there was a ballistic missile drill. And it was a drill, but this all came down to the fact that there was an epic design fail. So there was a drop-down menu in the computer program that the technicians were using, and there were two options: test missile alert and actual missile alert. And he was supposed to choose the test one, and he didn't. So you can actually go back. These have huge consequences in a way. Now, we're not dealing with that in a way with what we're doing, but we do take the work that we do in terms of educating students seriously. And so I would really kind of encourage you to think about this very seriously. And don't think that Sakai is one of those places that, is the only one that needs help with this. Even Canvas could use some help with this, as you can see from this little diagram here. If you have questions, let me know. But I'm glad everybody's here, and have a great rest of the day at the virtual conference.